So welcome once again to the 12 Days of Christmas, and we're on day number 6. Who's it going to be? A small part of Beatles history not many people know about. These are the 6 black guys in the black roots of the Beatles. One, which a lot of people know of, is Lord Woodbine. Harold Phillips, and Lord Woodbine, or Woody as he was known, was Alan Williams' business partner. He was helping Alan manage the Beatles in those early days in 1960. He was a calypso singer, and he had the Caribbean Steel Band. And so when they started playing at the Jacaranda, he was a big supporter of them. When they cleared off to Hamburg that first time, it was Woody and Alan who went over to Hamburg, met with Bruno Koschmider, made that initial contact. And it was then, of course, that Alan Williams and Woody get that gig for the Beatles in Hamburg. And the famous photo, "The Name Liveth Evermore," there's Woody as he was driving the van a lot of the time, driving over to Hamburg on that very first trip. So without him, well, what would have happened? Of course, there is the other story of Alan Williams and Lord Woodbine with their illegal strip club and the Beatles backing Janice the stripper. That's a story for another day, of course. Another guy to mention, Everett Estridge. Not a name that many people know. Again, when I was researching the Fab 104, the evolution of the Beatles, I came across Everett. He was a member of the Royal Caribbean Steel Band who played at the Jacaranda. He'd come over from Trinidad, like Woody had done, had been to London, heard there was going to be national service, so he legged it up to Liverpool to hide away. Yeah, don't tell the authorities that one. And he was part of that Caribbean Steel Band. He was the musical arranger. So what they were doing is they were taking popular songs of the day and he was arranging them for the steel pans. So a clever guy. So I interviewed him and got his stories. After Everett Estridge, we've got Zank's Logi. He's a guy from Guyana. He was a guitarist. And he was one of those guys when John, Paul and George were hanging around in the black clubs of Liverpool 8. He was showing them, particular John, different rhythms, different styles of playing the guitar. So Zank's Logi was really important, teaching the Beatles, particularly John, some really unusual sort of the calypso rhythms, different styles of playing the guitar that they picked up from their cultural roots, which was so important then to John, Paul and George as they developed their songwriting. So Zank's Logi, important guy. Next one is Vinnie Ishmael. Vinnie was part of a group called Vince and the Volcanoes. He went on to perform with a number of groups. But again, he was one of those local black guys who got to know John, Paul and George and was teaching them different styles on the guitar. But particularly what he was valued for was playing in the style of Chuck Berry. And they picked up a lot off Vinnie because he could play in the style that Chuck Berry had developed. And they learned so much from him. So Vinnie Ishmael, again, really important guy. The final one I want to tell you about is a guy called Jimmy James. Now, I got to know him. His name is Fitzroy James. He come from Trinidad. And again, in Fab 104, he told me his whole story of how the music of the steel pan developed in Trinidad, how he'd come over to Liverpool. And there's been doubt as to, did the Caribbean Steel Band really go over to Hamburg or not? Well, yes, because I can prove it. Because Jimmy James, steel pan player, he joined the Caribbean Steel Band after the others left and went to Hamburg. So he could verify that. And again, he was telling me the stories of being in the Jacaranda. And of course, once he's in the group, that John, Paul and George were hanging out in the Jack, of course. And they would go and they would talk to him. And they were so interested in the steel pans, how they were arranging all these different ones, the technology behind it. And apparently it's the most recent instrument to have been invented, the steel pan. Spree Simon, the guy credited with inventing it, was part of the Caribbean Steel Band in Liverpool for a time. So Jimmy James learned quite a lot from him. So he was telling me how important this style was, and also how important it was that the Caribbean Steel Band were playing at the Jacaranda. And if you think about this, in a Liverpool city centre, which is predominantly white, the black guys you would see were the ones that Alan Williams had hired, the steel band in the basement of the Jacaranda. And again, John, Paul and George were hanging out with them and picking up so much from them. So all of these guys are so important. So we've got Lord Woodbine, we've got Everett Estridge, we've got Zank's Logi, we've got Vinnie Ishmael, we've got Jimmy James. The final guy I want to mention is Jimmy Amarakpour. How does he come into it? Well, he was, again, black guy down in London at the Bag of Nails Club, and Paul McCartney gets to know him. And what's the phrase he uses? Obla di, obla da, which means life goes on. So that goes into a really famous Beatles song. So here again, it's one of these black roots of the Beatles, these important guys who just play a part in that story. So there's our 6 black roots of the Beatles. So don't forget, tune in tomorrow for number 7. So we've got 6 black roots, 5 parents bring 4 Fab Four, 3 bassmen, 2 harmonicas, and of course, a young man called Jeff Lee.